So I've been wanting to make some videos talking about different tracks on the 7D Media compilation that came out earlier this year. The first one I want to talk about is called Traveling Planetwide Bailiwick. Not the most concise title I've ever come up with. And chronologically, it's the oldest track on the anthology. I put out my first real album, Disruption Theory, in '99, but this track, Traveling Planetwide Bailiwick, was actually recorded in '97. I didn't release it until 2015. I put out an anthology of older ambient looping stuff. But it was recorded in '97, and it's a good place to start just because the mid-'90s was a period where a lot of the common threads that have kind of ended up defining my musical work. For most of my adult life, a lot of that stuff started really kind of taking hold and like getting clarified and defined in my head in the mid-'90s. And there were a few different things happening there. With respect to the anthology, the first thing I want to talk about is actually King Crimson, and more specifically Discipline Global Mobile, which is the record label that Robert Fripp and I believe David Singleton was his partner. Correct me in the comments if I'm wrong. But basically, that was the independent record label that Robert Fripp started in, I think, '93 or '94. And this was the first time that I was a Crimson fan and new stuff was being released, which is always kind of exciting. You know, it's one thing to read about old kind of iconic seminal releases and think about what it would have been like to be paying attention when they came out and be part of the cultural dialogue that happens when an album gets released. But to actually have that being the case while I was aware of it and while I was actively a fan was really exciting. And DGM was not just about King Crimson. They put out a lot of different artists. The California Guitar Trio got started through DGM, I believe. Band called 10 Seconds, founded by Bill Forth, a really great kind of industrial proggy recording. I'm very lucky now to count Bill Forth as a good friend of mine. And this is also how I first became aware of Trey Gunn. Trey was part of the double trio version of King Crimson that was active in the mid-'90s. And he also had a solo album called 1000 Years that DGM put out around that same time. And I really loved that album. 1000 Years was a big record for me. It had a lot of elements that I really liked and combined them in a lot of different ways that were very kind of new and fresh and very appealing to me. Maybe because he was a younger and a newer guy in the lineup, maybe that appealed to me too. I think I was 20 years old in 1994, so, you know, there may have been some generational connection or identification happening there as well. And even before that, there was the album The First Day with Robert Fripp and David Sylvian. And Trey Gunn played on that recording, and there's a great picture in the liner notes of Trey kind of standing there with his touch guitar and his rack of electronic gear, and it's such a great photo. It just has, you know, such a great vibe to it. So, you know, he had definitely caught my eye as this sort of renaissance period of DGM releases and King Crimson activity was coming into being. I mentioned this because, of course, Trey is the guy who founded the label that my stuff is out on now. So I am definitely, on a personal level, very, very stoked and delighted by that turn of events. The DGM era also had kind of a particular sound to it. I think a lot of mid-'90s recordings had, I wouldn't say a harsh digital high end, but it was definitely a little on the crispy side. Digital audio was relatively new in terms of being a widespread thing in the mid-'90s. I mean, digital audio predates that by quite a bit, but it was really like the mid-'90s where it seemed like a lot of people had access to that gear and were using that gear. I think the Alesis ADAT had a lot to do with that. The advent of hard disk recording definitely helped as well. And this track, Traveling Planetwide Bailiwick, reminds me of the Discipline Global Mobile era in some ways. It has a bit of that kind of sound to it, that, you know, very kind of crisp, high-endy digital kind of thing going on. It's pretty ambient. It's in an odd time signature, which is something I was very into in the mid-'90s. And then at a certain point, I just kind of abandoned it for no good reason. I just got hung up with 4/4, I guess. So definitely, I would say the DGM era, the whole mid-90s slew of releases and activity, was really inspiring for me. And I really liked a lot of the recordings that DGM put out during that era. I was really intrigued by a lot of the stuff. I saw the double trio version of King Crimson, I think 3 times in the space of 1 year. My graduation recital at CalArts, also in 97, I played 6 songs, 3 of which were King Crimson tunes, and I played it in a quartet with 2 guitars and 2 drum sets. So I was very into them. I was definitely a fanboy. So again, on a personal level, you know, having that kind of come around and getting my stuff released through Trey's label, it's great. It's great. Not gonna lie, as the kids no longer say, because it's already a passé phrase, but not gonna lie, it's really meaningful on a personal level. So I was very much a Crimson fanboy, and like a lot of fanboys, I had a lot of stuff in my playing and my music making that was very clearly from those guys, from Robert in particular, because I'm a guitar player. And I was a looping guitar player as well, something I'll touch on in a second. I subsequently spent a lot of time and energy trying to get out from under the shadow that Crimson and Fripp cast. When people talk about originality and finding your own voice in music and the arts, there's generally, I would say, 2 schools of thought. There's one that basically says you're a human being, you're a unique individual, so you naturally already are a unique voice. And accept that, accept that your particular combination of influences and interest is going to manifest in a unique way because you are a unique person, and let the chips fall as they may. Let your voice be however unusual or commonplace as it may happen to be. That's one of the main schools of thought when it comes to originality and finding a voice, I would say. The other main school of thought is kind of coming from the opposite point of view, and it says that to find an original voice and to find something that is kind of your own, you need to deliberately divest yourselves of a lot of your influences and your inspirations, and you have to deliberately try to get rid of the things in your playing and your music making that seem particularly derivative of a particular artist. And you need to kind of strip this stuff away and see what you have when you get rid of that stuff, and kind of deconstruct yourself and kill your darlings is the saying. I don't know if that applies to this sort of thing necessarily, but it's very much kind of like, I'm gonna like deconstruct myself and get rid of all my influences and force myself to part with the things I love to see what is left after that. That is the school of thought that I have tended to subscribe to for most of my life. So for me, a lot of the subsequent looping stuff that I did, from like 2002 onwards into the present day, a lot of that was fueled by trying to divest myself of what I felt were the trappings of prog looping. And there was definitely a school of ambient progressive rock guitar in the mid-90s. Not coincidentally, the mid-90s was also the birth of the dedicated live looping device as an actual category. People did live looping before the mid-90s, of course, but up until the mid-90s, they were doing it with things like delays, echoes, reel-to-reel tape decks, things that had been modified either in terms of the way that they operated or in terms of the way that they were being used, or both, in order to facilitate looping. But those things were not designed first and foremost as live loopers. They were things that were being used and appropriated to facilitate that kind of thing. In the mid-90s, suddenly you had the emergence of dedicated live looping devices. There was the Paratus Loop Delay, the Lexicon Jam Man, the Echoplex Digital Pro, which is the thing that I bonded with. The Boomerang Looper, I think, came out around the same time. So this was the first time that there was actually like a category of devices that had been built specifically for live looping. I don't mean to sound like an old man shaking his fist at the clouds, but kids today who can go into any guitar store and expect to find like a sub $100 live looping pedal don't know what it was like way back then. And there's no particular reason they need to. But that was the environment that I got into looping through. That was what was going on in kind of the bigger musical landscape when I got interested in looping. That's what got me into looping. The fact that there were hardware loopers and that persuaded me to check it out in a way that I might not otherwise have done. I remember the idea of using reel-to-reel tape was very unappealing to me for some reason at that point in time. I didn't like the idea of hooking up tape decks at all. I had done a little bit of stuff with cranking up the feedback on delay devices. And it's interesting because I remember going to a music store in early 94, mid 94, and trying out a Jam Man. And I remember thinking, yeah, this is pretty cool. Yeah, I like this. I dig it. I wasn't immediately in love with it. It wasn't like an immediate thing that just grabbed my soul, but it definitely caught my interest, and I kind of kept that in the back of my mind. I didn't really try any other dedicated looping devices until the fall of 95 when I got my Echoplex Digital Pro. And I remember trying it in a music store and just bonding with it immediately. It clicked with me. It just really made sense. Like, yeah, this is great. This is appealing to me. This is something I want to check out. This is something I want to dig into. So I guess this fall it'll be 30 years since I first got an EDP. But yeah, that was the climate that I entered the looping world in. That's what the looping world was at that point in time, at least as far as dedicated hardware looping devices. And not everybody who had one of those devices was a King Crimson fan. It would be misleading to say that, but an awful lot of people were. And I came to realize, partially through a mailing list called Looper's Delight that started in 96. It was started by a guy named Kim Flint, who was one of the guys behind the Echoplex Digital Pro. His partner, Matthias Grobe, was the other main guy involved with that. And Looper's Delight changed my life in a lot of ways, not the least of which being that I and the other people on the list suddenly kind of realized that there was a genre of post-prog ambient guitar looping that a lot of people were active in. At that point in time, it was easy to feel like if you were doing looping with an EBow and a lot of effects processing and that kind of thing, then you were the only person who did that. And truth be told, there were not a whole lot of people doing that if you look at it from a global point of view. But there definitely was a scene scattered across the globe. And being part of that mailing list, kind of made us realize that there was like a cohesive aesthetic genre at work there, which was both good and bad. It was nice to have a sense of identification and connection with other people. It also made a lot of people, myself very much included, realize that we were a lot less unique and a lot less original than we had probably been giving ourselves credit for. And that the stuff that we had been doing was actually not that experimental because it was kind of a well-established, well-codified musical language and territory. And that caused me to kind of, rethink some things. It was like, oh, other people do this stuff and they sound really good at it too. So maybe this is not like such a unique thing, or maybe it's a relatively unique thing, but maybe I need to reconsider my approach to it. So yeah, you had the advent of live looping, you had the King Crimson Renaissance period with Discipline Global Mobile and the Double Trio. Also during that time, I was enrolled at CalArts, and I was there from 94 to 97. And that was obviously a seminal part of my life and very much kind of shaped who I became as a musician and as a human being as well. It's an art school, as you would expect from the name, and some music schools are kind of almost trade schools or vocational schools, and the idea is they're going to teach you what you need to learn and be able to know and play and do in order to be a gigging working musician. CalArts was really about trying to figure out what a person was as a unique individual, as a unique creative musician. And a lot of the feedback that we got from a lot of different people in the faculty was, kind of like, what is your contribution? What is the angle that you're approaching this from? What is your voice, basically? And that was one of the things that I found appealing about it as a prospective student when I visited in 94. You know, the fact that a lot of what I heard was really unusual, interesting music that I hadn't really encountered before. And it seemed like a really fertile environment to study a lot of the stuff that I was interested in and to be exposed to a lot of stuff that I wasn't aware of. I studied with Miroslav Tadic for several years. He changed my life in innumerable ways. Partially because of studying with Miroslav, I started becoming more aware of David Torn. I knew that Miroslav had done some work with David Torn. It made sense to me that this would be a good opportunity to find out more about Torn. And this was also, Torn was having a bit of a renaissance period in the mid-90s as well. He was doing a lot of stuff with a record label called CMP. He put out those two amazing solo albums in the mid-90s, What Means Solid Traveler and Tripping Over God. And What Means Solid Traveler, again, was a life-changing thing for me. I've kind of spent most of my recording life trying to remake that album, I half-jokingly say. And I've never managed it, but it's still fun to try. And you know, Torn, of course, is huge in the looping world, and he was back then as well. It was a little harder for me to figure out what he was doing. Listening to the recordings, you know, with Fripp's approach to looping, and I would say a lot of the Crimson world, a lot of those people, I would say, it was relatively easy to kind of hear it and think, okay, I can hear the phrase that's repeating. I can hear, you know, where this is like a long delay line that is building up layers of sound, and now the feedback's coming down, so you're getting rid of the old layers and that sort of thing. With Torn stuff, it was harder for me to figure out what was going on. I think partially because he used the element of looping in a lot of different ways in his music. And also, I think he had, this is not a criticism of anybody, but I feel like even back then, I think Torn had kind of a wider range of approaches to looping. I don't think he was specifically tied to one approach or one way of doing things. So I think there was kind of a more diverse color palette that he painted with. At least that was my very subjective take at the time. It was harder for me to steal his stuff. It was harder for me to rip off his stuff looping-wise because it was harder for me to tell what he was doing in the first place. Can we put it that way? No offense to Fripp or anybody else, God knows. So yeah, between being at CalArts, discovering David Torn's work, being in the middle of the birth of live looping devices as a dedicated hardware category and coming into the looping world as a result of that emergence of gear, following the Crimson world during the 90s when DGM was putting out a lot of great stuff and the double trio was touring a lot. All that stuff like ended up being huge kind of foundations for me as far as who I was and still am as a musician. So the performance, Traveling Planetwide Bailiwick, represents a lot of the stuff that I subsequently tried to distance myself from in a lot of ways. It's ambient, it's got a lot of textural stuff, it's echoey, there's ebo, there's whammy pedal, it's in an odd time signature. So a lot of my mid-90s obsessions were kind of front and center with that stuff. And as time went on, I came to realize that I was kind of doing that stuff because I thought that's what I was supposed to be doing with guitar looping. You know, I thought, okay, it's a live looping device, so I'm supposed to be getting these big ambient textures and these big washes of sound and these slowly evolving, like, soundscapes. And I kind of realized that I was playing to my expectations of that stuff, at least as much as I was playing to my own interest. It's a lot of fun to do that kind of thing, but even back then I realized that it was more fun to create that stuff for me than it was to listen to it. Listening to my own stuff and also listening to other people's stuff, I wasn't that into it as a listener. That changed over time, but you know, I was basically realizing that a lot of my interest in looping was based in my expectations of what looping was supposed to be. And a lot of my work after that, a lot of my subsequent work was about trying to get rid of that stuff and get rid of everything that I assumed or expected was supposed to be part of guitar looping, and saying, okay, if you get rid of all this stuff, if you get rid of the ebo, if you get rid of the ambient, like, stereo imaging and ping pong delays and textural everything. If you get rid of that stuff, what do you have left? What do you do with guitar looping if you don't have that stuff? And that's what I started really trying to answer in 2001, 2002. But all of that stuff was kind of a reaction to the stuff I was doing in the mid 90s, of which this particular track I think is a really solid example.